The United States has had enough. It believes it's spending too much on defending countries thousands of miles away from its borders, and it's about time it all stopped. That money should go to defending America at home, which can only mean one thing: a complete withdrawal from NATO. We'll be explaining what happens next on today's episode of the Infographics Show as we explore NATO's fate without the US day by day. Day 1. It's a move that's been a year in the making. The United States triggered Article 13 of the NATO treaty by providing a notice of denunciation to the rest of the group's members. Ironically, the US gave that notice to itself per Article 13 before disseminating the information to NATO's 31 other members. It was huge news at the time, but the process was slow enough to give Europe's leaders hope. Maybe the US president would change their mind over the course of a year. They would see how valuable NATO was both to America's defense and to its ability to project power and influence over the rest of the world. After all, wasn't America the only nation to have ever triggered Article 5 of the NATO treaty, asking others to come to its aid in the wake of the September 11, 2001 attacks on its territory? Surely that had to count for something. Unfortunately for the rest of NATO, the US doesn't change its mind. The one-year denunciation period ends, and the US starts actively preparing for withdrawal from NATO. That starts with the military bases America has dotted around Europe. Alarm bells are ringing in the commands of those military bases. There are dozens of those bases being hosted by America's former NATO comrades. Germany, Poland, the UK, Belgium, Norway, Spain, and Portugal are all home to US military personnel. All told, there are over 40 bases spanning from Greenland, which is owned by NATO member Denmark, and Turkey's border with Russia. They all start shutting down. Day 2. The shutdown is moving faster than anybody could have anticipated, and it all starts with the withdrawal of the 20,000 soldiers the US sent to the smaller NATO member states bordering Russia and Belarus. Those 20,000 US soldiers, who are primarily stationed in the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, along with Poland and Romania, don't all leave at once. It takes time to complete a full withdrawal, but they're on their way out. Elsewhere in Europe, similar withdrawals are starting at other US military bases. Germany starts losing many of the 39,000 American personnel it has stationed in its country. Hundreds of the 10,000 American soldiers in the UK are packed into ships and planes as they head back home. Italy's 13,000 US troops are also leaving. It'll take several months for the US to pull its forces out entirely, but by the time it's done, Europe's NATO members will have lost between 75,000 and 105,000 soldiers from the US Army, Navy, and Air Force. But there is one bright spot for Europe's NATO members. The American soldiers may be going back home, but they're leaving behind billions of dollars of infrastructure. The US can't exactly pack up its bases and send them back home, and it spent heavily on its European NATO bases. In 2022 alone, America poured $3.8 billion into its European Deterrence Initiative Fund, followed by $4.2 billion a year later. Most of that money went to building airfields, storage facilities, and training complexes, all of which the US leaves behind. Sure, the storage facilities are gradually emptied of America's weapons in the coming months, but they're all on land that Europe owns, and the US can't justify or execute the demolition of the infrastructure it's spent so long building. But at least the US is saving some money. It paid 66% of the $2.5 billion annual cost of using and supplying those bases, with its allies covering the other 34%. Those NATO allies now have to cover 100% of the costs, with the US saving itself about $1.65 billion per year, a drop in the ocean for a country that spends over $840 billion on defense annually. Day 10. The withdrawal is well underway, and the leaders of Europe's NATO members are panicking. They had a year to prepare for what was coming, but they still weren't ready. That's pretty typical of Europe. The European Union, or EU, often finds itself mired in debates. With so much crossover between EU and NATO members, there's been a whole lot of talking about what to do when the US withdraws, and not enough action. On day 10 of America's NATO withdrawal, more talking comes. European leaders, including France's president and the UK's prime minister and Germany's chancellor, convene in Brussels to discuss what happens next. Some of those leaders have plans. Germany, for instance, is already readying itself to take control of the bases the US is deserting. The same goes for the UK and Italy. All of these countries talk about the changes they're making to their militaries so they can make use of the infrastructure the US is leaving behind. But arguments are already starting. The Baltic states are especially concerned. With the loss of the 20,000 soldiers the US primarily stationed in those three countries, they are all severely weakened. Combined, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia only have around 48,000 soldiers. It's a solid combined force, but it is nowhere near strong enough to deal with the 1.3 million plus soldiers that Russia could flood those nations with. The Baltic states tell NATO's European leaders that they are the vanguard for NATO. They're the first line of defense against the biggest threat NATO faces, and they are severely underpowered. They need more troops and equipment now. But as is so often the case in Europe, there are no immediate commitments. The UK, France, and Germany all promise soldiers to the Baltics, but they don't say how many or when those soldiers will arrive. They need to protect themselves first, which means building up their own militaries before they look further afield. The meeting is tense. Divisions are already starting to form as America's protective umbrella is pulled away from NATO's European members, and all the while, Russia is salivating at the prospect of taking on this new version of NATO, but that can't happen yet. But in the coming months, we'll start to see Russia make some interesting moves that further weaken NATO in Europe. Day 14. NATO's European members are hit with another blow. America's nuclear weapons are leaving along with its troops. NATO's nuclear sharing program hasn't disappeared, but the largest contributor to that program has. The US stationed nuclear weapons in 5 NATO nations before it withdrew: Belgium, Italy, Germany, Turkey, and the Netherlands. Over the next few months, those nukes are taken back home, removing the nuclear blanket that has so long protected Europe. That's not to say that the remaining NATO members are completely without nuclear weapons. The UK has 225 nukes, with France bringing 290 to NATO. Germany in particular is keen to become the new home of some of those nuclear weapons. It has a good argument. Germany is closer to Russia than either France or the UK. It seems like a natural choice for stationing, but it's also clear that NATO's nuclear threat has been significantly reduced. Even looking beyond the 100 American nuclear weapons the US removes from its European NATO bases, the simple fact is that NATO without the US is a long way behind Russia in the nuclear warhead game. Moscow's stockpile stands at just under 5,600 nukes. That's more than enough to devastate all of European NATO multiple times over if war broke out. America has over 5,200 nukes that, with France and the UK, previously put NATO's stockpile just above Russia's. Now NATO has only around a tenth of the nuclear weapons Russia has. The UK also has a problem with its Trident nuclear missiles. Though technically independent, those warheads rely heavily on American technology and infrastructure, along with US cooperation in testing and maintenance. All of that is gone, with the UK forced into negotiating expensive contracts with the US to ensure Trident remains usable as a nuclear deterrent. These types of logistical problems start to cause issues in the coming weeks. For now, France and the UK are figuring out what to do on the nuclear front. Negotiations are ongoing with Germany, though all three countries agree stationing nuclear weapons in Berlin is best for all involved. The UK and France are also quietly talking about teaming up to build more nukes. Nothing has been said to the remaining NATO members yet. Neither country wants to antagonize a Russia that's already gloating and throwing nuclear threats around at the remains of NATO. But both know that they, and NATO by extension, need to create a stronger nuclear threat. Month 1. European NATO is starting to struggle. Losing the US troops stationed in Europe took its toll. Most of the continent's NATO members have been forced to scramble to repopulate the military bases the US left behind. The nuclear weapons stationed in Germany and several other countries are leaving. Leaders within Europe are already quarreling amongst themselves about what to do next. They'll need to come up with some answers soon. A month into the US leaving NATO, it's become very clear just how vital the US was to Europe's military logistics. In 2016, the US and EU signed an Acquisition and Cross-Servicing Agreement, or ACSA. According to the EU, this agreement facilitated a reciprocal provision of reimbursable logistics support, supplies, and services between the European Union and the United States during military deployments and operations. In other words, the US and its European compatriots in NATO cooperated intensely on the continent to make it easier for European troops to move supplies and people around. That is all gone now. While the ACSA might still exist after a month, it's practically a lame duck agreement. The US is pulling out, and it's taking so many of the logistical advantages it brought with it out of the NATO equation. Losing that support will have far-reaching consequences for the new NATO. Of course, no US means no American troops, vehicles, or logistics in the event of a war. However, European NATO has also lost the US as a training partner and a potential supplier of military equipment that it can use to fend off threats. Europe has also lost access to America's intelligence, meaning it knows far less than it did before about what its enemies might be doing. There's now an even deeper lack of unity within Europe. There were already signs of this division forming when the European leaders met in the wake of America's withdrawal, but historic decisions are also starting to weigh down. As Carnegie Europe's Judy Dempsey points out, European NATO as a collective refused to unify many of its weapon systems, including tanks, fighter aircraft, and helicopters. Sure, there are some instances of cooperation, such as Britain and France working together to create Storm Shadow missiles. However, those are often isolated examples. That lack of unity throws European NATO's logistics into chaos, and it's not going to be an easy problem to fix when the remaining NATO members can't even reach a consensus on the level of threat facing them. The new NATO needs to get on the same page, fast. But in the months that follow, things are not all rosy for the United States either. Month 2. The immediate mood upon the US's withdrawal from NATO was celebratory, at least in some quarters of the country, but problems are starting to form. For so long, the US was the glue that kept the NATO alliance together. The existence of NATO also led to the US being the main deterrent against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, along with being a key player in NATO's campaigns in the Balkans. The US also spearheaded the provision of military aid to Ukraine during its war with Russia, both directly and by selling weapon systems to allies that were later sent to Ukraine. Through NATO, the US has spent decades building geopolitical influence through its alliances with other NATO members. It was all a part of America's free world policies. For the 75 years or so of its NATO membership, the US was able to lead the Western world in following a rule-based system that enabled America to project power. Democracies all over the world used the US as their standard-bearer, their gold standard. Through its alliances, the US was able to support international institutions, bolster trade, and open up markets for itself. By the second month of its withdrawal from NATO, America is quickly learning what happens when it turns its back on that approach. On the power projection front, America has lost one of its most important forward presences. It's no longer a direct threat to Russia via the bases it maintained in Europe. The US has also catastrophically damaged its relationships with the remaining members of NATO. All European countries trusted America to be the binding force and the main power projector that keeps threats like Russia at bay. That trust is now broken, and the US is starting to feel the sting. Of course, the US can fend for itself. It has oceans on either side of it, the Atlantic and the Pacific, that protect it against China and Russia. The country also produces enough oil to meet its own energy needs. For instance, 2020 saw America produce 18.4 million barrels of oil daily, at a time when its population needed 18.12 million. The US is also fine on the food front. In 2010 alone, its agricultural sector produced enough food to offer 4,000 calories per day per person, more than enough to feed its population. But none of that changes the fact that trade in oil, food, and in so many other commodities is vital to the US. Trade between the US and EU, the latter of which includes many of NATO's European members, totaled $975.9 billion in 2024. With the US importing $605.8 billion of goods from Europe during that year. Trade with the UK, a NATO member that isn't part of the EU, amounted to almost $380 billion. That trade doesn't simply go away now that the US has withdrawn from NATO. However, the trust issue is in play. NATO's European members no longer trust the US to follow through on its promises. That leads to many of NATO's European members looking elsewhere when it comes to trade. They can't cut the US off entirely. That would lead to economic catastrophe. But America is starting to fall off as the trade behemoth it's always been in the past. And there is one area where America is really feeling that sting. Month 3. So much of America's disentanglement from NATO was predicated on the idea that NATO's European allies weren't doing enough to protect themselves. Veiled threats were made. The US suggested it might not protect NATO members that don't hit the organization's 2% of gross domestic product spending target on defense. Europe was told it needed to figure out how to defend itself without American involvement. It's starting to do just that, and that shift in approach is having an impact on America's arms trade 3 months into the US pulling out of NATO. There were already signs that European NATO was working to decouple itself from America's weapons sector before the US withdrew. In December 2024, Britain signed a deal with aerospace firms in Italy and Japan to work on the development of a new 6th-generation fighter jet. Those plans are accelerated, with European NATO members canceling purchases of F-35s from the US as they anticipate the arrival of a European alternative. Across Europe, we see weapons manufacturers, including Germany's Rheinmetall and Britain's BAE, receiving new contracts for land weapon systems that may have previously gone to the US. The effect isn't immediate. Contracts that have already been signed are often still in effect, though there have been some cancellations. However, the US won't see record numbers of exports for its arms industry again anytime soon. In 2024, America earned a massive $318.7 billion from arms exports, representing a 29% increase from the previous year. Much of that money came from NATO nations buying American weapon systems to send to Ukraine and replenish their own stockpiles. In the coming months, European NATO will focus on building up the defense industry on the continent, reducing its reliance on America's weapons. The net result for the US? Tens of billions of dollars of lost weapons trade to add to the billions it may lose in goods and services trading. Again, it all comes down to trust. How can the remaining 31 NATO members trust America's weapons now that the US has withdrawn? After all of those weapons require US involvement beyond manufacturing, including US-led maintenance, training, and intelligence. It's much better to centralize all of that and cut the US out. NATO's decision to move away from American-made weapons also creates domestic problems for America. Though the US spends around $850 billion per year on defense, companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing still rely on overseas sales. Fewer sales mean profits are down, which ultimately leads to thousands of Americans losing their jobs. Still, at least America has what it wanted. In a sense, Europe is learning to defend itself. What it might not have expected is that European NATO is becoming more self-sufficient and will hit American pocketbooks hard. Month 6. The cyber attacks have started, affecting both the US and the remaining members of NATO. This was inevitable. America's withdrawal from the Collective Defense Alliance created obvious openings for the likes of Russia and China. Both have already been extremely active on the cyber front, even when the US was a part of NATO. Between 2000 and 2024, Russia launched 378 cyber attacks with a political dimension. China, Iran, and North Korea weren't far behind. They launched 340, 154, and 153 attacks respectively. With NATO weakened by America's withdrawal, these politically focused attacks ramp up. Europe and the US are inundated with fake news, social media profiles, and attacks on their political systems to create even more division. Without cooperation between the US and NATO, those attacks are harder to stop. More worrying, especially for the US, is the threat that these cyber attacks create to the Western nuclear deterrent. It's believed that Chinese hackers have been active in American computer systems for at least 5 years. Beijing could use this to launch a crippling cyber attack that makes it harder for the US to count on its nukes. Those based on land face key threats, with cyber attacks capable of taking their launch systems offline. However, the US also discovers its nuclear threat isn't as powerful because it's no longer part of NATO. America's F-35s and nuclear bombers may be among the best in the world, but that doesn't mean much if they're isolated in the US. European NATO won't allow America to use its bases as stop-off or launching points anymore. That leaves America's submarine fleet as its main nuclear option. Those submarines are effective. However, the US has only 14 of its Ohio-class submarines capable of launching ballistic missiles. If cyber attacks and a lack of cooperation take out America's other nuclear options, the door is open for Russia or China to become the world's key power players. Speaking of which, Year 1. With America's decoupling from NATO came 2 major blows to Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Europe did the best it could, but with so many of the weapons provided to Ukraine being of American origin, combined with the diplomatic squabbles within European NATO, Ukraine couldn't hold out for much longer. It capitulates. Russia takes Ukraine and begins a period of recovery. Without the US as a part of NATO, Russia can contain its threat to Europe and not worry about American intervention. Over the next few years, an arms race develops in Europe, Russia having already built a military-industrial complex to ensure weapons keep flowing to its troops in Ukraine, has the advantage. It also has alliances with countries like North Korea, with which it has a mutual defense pact, China, and Iran. All three become more confident in supplying Russia with weapons to make up for its manufacturing shortfalls. Europe is forced to play catch-up. Bruegel suggests European NATO would need 300,000 more soldiers and a collective defense spending hike of over $270 billion to catch up to Russia. That would add to the 1.5 million active military personnel NATO has. Plus, European NATO still has access to more advanced weaponry than Russia, even if it can't match in sheer volume. But there is one thing that NATO doesn't have, with or without the United States: Russia's brutality and imperialistic ambition, combined with the forced unity that comes with being led by an authoritarian. Both Russia and the remains of NATO are preparing for a fight. Year 3. Russia is ready to fill the security vacuum left behind by America's withdrawal from NATO. Europe has managed to prepare itself for a fight in many respects. Britain and France chose to stage some of their nuclear weapons in Germany, though conversations about staging them in other NATO member nations closer to Russia stalled. Therein lie the problem for the remains of NATO. Division still exists. While nations like Poland and Germany ramped up their defense spending, 3 years wasn't enough to create the unified weapon systems and logistical systems European NATO lacked once the US withdrew. Russia takes advantage. After spending 2 years replenishing its military, it goes on the attack. The Baltic nations, so long considered the vanguard of European NATO, stand no chance. European NATO stationed tens of thousands of troops in the country, but it wasn't enough to create a solid frontline defense. Russia takes on each individually. It has also learned its lessons from the early weeks of the Ukraine war. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, along with thousands of tanks and artillery, pour into the Baltics in a shock-and-awe campaign designed to destroy Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania quickly. It works. The former Ukraine becomes a Russian staging area for attacks against Moldova and Romania, with the Baltic nations quickly falling. Russia is also able to use the Baltic Sea to stage naval attacks on Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Its ground forces march into Poland via Belarus and the former Ukraine. But European NATO doesn't capitulate. Far from it, in fact. Though slow to respond to Russia's shock-and-awe campaign against some of the less militarily strong NATO nations, hundreds of thousands of troops pour into the front lines. Canada, which is still a NATO member, provides troops and equipment to support Europe, officially starting World War III. The US now faces a tough decision. It's no longer a part of NATO. It isn't duty-bound to protect its former NATO allies. But does it simply stand back and watch as Russia pushes to take over as much of Europe as it can? Perhaps it'll try to serve as a peacekeeper, but in doing so it could unintentionally hand Russia a powerful advantage. With NATO weakened, Russia may leverage the shift to reassert control over the former Soviet states, all while pushing for a peace deal on its own terms with what remains of European NATO. Or maybe the US will simply stay isolated, allowing European NATO and Russia to fight it out in a war that dramatically weakens both nations. The weakening could create openings for the US to become an influential force in Europe once more, as it takes advantage of its former NATO colleagues needing its military and economic help. Only time will tell. The war in Ukraine is the most destructive conflict that Europe has seen since the Second World War. And it's all NATO's fault, because NATO is weak. No, this video isn't sponsored by the Russian Ministry of Defense. The fact is, the invasion of Ukraine is NATO's greatest failure in its short history, and it failed because the entire alliance is a shadow of its former self. The Great Peace dividend at the end of the Cold War finally made Europeans as weak as the Soviets always claimed they were. Even the United States severely curtailed its military capabilities. Now the peace is over, and war is in Europe because NATO decided to take a 30-year nap. NATO was originally founded after the Second World War. Surveying the destruction in Europe and the rise of the Soviet Union, the US asked Europe, "Hey, what if we make the most Chad military alliance of all time?" To which Europe replied, "Yeah, that's a great idea. And hey, also, what if you pay for like most of it?" Thus, NATO was born out of a desire to ensure peace in Europe and deter a third, far more catastrophic world war. The containment and deterrence of the Soviet Union was a top priority for everyone who didn't like the idea of turning the world into a permanent fallout LARP event. But even a conventional war with the Soviets would be catastrophic for Europe and inevitably end with many of the continental European powers becoming yet another Soviet republic. And that's why the United States was integral to the alliance. But this required it to station a large amount of its forces in Europe itself. Otherwise, it would take months to build significant military power in Europe, by which time Soviet hordes would have overrun most of the continent. But the alliance didn't just see the US as a safeguard against the Soviet invasion, it was also a check against the resurgence of a different evil altogether. For the better part of, well, its entire history, Europe has struggled with nationalism. During the first half of the 20th century, however, the rise of nationalism across the continent set the stage for two catastrophic wars. Left reeling in the wake of the Second World War, both the US and the exhausted Western powers feared that from the ashes a fresh wave of nationalism would spring up. Now, some trilogies are great, Lord of the Rings, Alien, but other trilogies are crimes against humanity, The Hobbit, and World Wars. Nobody had any interest in yet another war arising from Europe's favorite hobby of electing a dictator into power and then bashing your neighbor's face in with a bunch of tanks. The US took on the form of a Hobbesian benevolent leviathan and was seen as a check against the rise of nationalism in Europe. NATO would make the US heavily invested in European security, ensuring it didn't simply lose interest again and piss off across the pond like it did for much of the previous 100 years. Americans, for their part, were extremely skeptical in further involvement in Europe after 2 world wars, and isolationism has always run deep in America due to the security of having 2 oceans between itself and the rest of the world. Rome may burn again tomorrow, but the Americans will still be eating cheeseburgers and chasing Bigfoot unless the barbarians build a fleet of aircraft carriers. But the best way to avoid conflict is for everyone to get along in a nice, tight little huddle where no one has the room to reach for a gun. That's why NATO's third goal was to promote European unity. After 2 world wars and centuries of devastating conflicts, the best and brightest military and political minds on the continent got together to debate the future of Europe. After making the observation that Europe has historically launched devastating war after devastating war every 10 to 20 or so years, someone got the brilliant idea of, what if we don't anymore? And the goal of European unity was born. Thus, NATO served to create the groundwork for the European Union, which would ultimately be the best guarantor of peace. If Europeans could stop fighting each other, here's looking at you, France and Britain, and Germany, then another world war would likely be prevented. Further, European unity encouraged political integration, a matter of much concern as communism spread its tentacles across war-torn Central Europe, and after the overthrow of the Czech Republic's government by rebels. Therefore, the Soviet Union saw communism as the only way to ensure its own survival against the capitalist West, and thus the stage was naturally set for conflict between the 2 blocs. In 1949, NATO was officially born, and war disappeared forever. Well, not quite, but to its credit, NATO truly is the most successful international alliance of all time. The Delian League may have protected Europe from being overrun by a Persian invasion, irrevocably changing its entire history, but it didn't stop the outbreak of a world-ending nuclear war. NATO's greatest success is ensuring that the Cold War never turned hot. Through a combination of containment and deterrence, NATO was able to ensure that any conflict between itself and the Soviet Union would incur costs too unbearable or simply not have the seeds it needed to ferment. Without NATO, a fragmented Europe would have been torn by the struggle between capitalist West and communist East, creating a nightmare of potential powder kegs that could signal the opening festivities to the Third and final World War. NATO's greatest strength was presenting a unified face against Soviet expansionism and political influence, even if that did mean occasionally the individual states would take decidedly undemocratic measures to silence pro-communist individuals. Hey, you either get to own the means of production or you get to not live through a nuclear holocaust. NATO's second greatest strength was, well, its strength. Unified, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was far more powerful than any individual state, and this is what allowed the alliance to stand against an at times aggressive Soviet Union. The alliance was ready to exact a blood cost from the Soviets for any push into Western Europe, both by conventional or nuclear means. But that was tricky, given the alliance's greatest military power by a long margin was all the way across the ocean. In essence, the United States was like the Justice League's Superman to Europe's Batman. Batman is cooler, he often has better story arcs, and he has free healthcare. But when the Soviets and Darkseid come invading, you really want Superman out there punching T-62 tanks with big, dumb, super strong fists. The challenge for the alliance was that most of America's firepower was across the sea or in other potential hotspots. Sometimes its military was heavily involved elsewhere, such as during the Vietnam War, and other times it was busy liberating South American democracies from themselves. During the Vietnam War alone, a significant amount of U.S. firepower was tied up for nearly 2 decades, and it was here that NATO was more important than ever before. By presenting a unified front, the Western European powers presented a significant obstacle to the Soviets, even without full U.S. commitment. But things may not have been that way, which is why NATO's political maneuvering was also one of its greatest victories. Spain, for example, could have been a serious chink in NATO's armor up until it joined the alliance in 1982. But this future was far from certain. After Spain's Francisco Franco died in 1975, it was Juan Carlos, King of Spain and appointed ruler by Franco, who led the nation through democratic reforms. But the Soviets had attempted to heavily influence Franco, albeit without much success given that Franco fought the communists during the Spanish Civil War. Had things gone differently, Spain might have been the westernmost member of the Soviet bloc, a move which would have escalated tensions in Europe to unfathomable levels. Deft political maneuvering and the culture of European unity fostered by NATO helped ensure that this did not come to pass. NATO's unity, however, also helped to severely curtail nuclear proliferation, further adding to its list of successes. Under Article 5 of the Alliance Charter, an attack on one member is an attack on all, and this includes nuclear weapons. The early Cold War was a crazy time. The world was rebuilding from a catastrophic war, liberalizing its values, the Beach Boys were selling Americana around the world, and the threat of nuclear annihilation hung over the head of every nation on the planet. The nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki sent a very loud and clear message to every country. The only way to not get nuked is to have nukes. Thankfully, the scientific knowledge and technical expertise to build a nuclear weapons program made it very expensive and extremely hard to develop nuclear weapons, but that still left it within the scope of many of the world's leading nations. Working to limit the spread of nuclear weapons and reduce the risk of self-extinction via aggressive stupidity, the United States brought in countries from around the world under its nuclear umbrella, and NATO was instrumental in helping that happen. But NATO also legitimized America's promise to go nuke for nuke with anyone launching a nuclear weapon against a non-NATO partner such as Japan or South Korea. Without that legitimacy, both of these nations would rightly question whether the US would truly be willing to trade Los Angeles for Seoul or Tokyo in a nuclear war. And the answer is no, absolutely not. But we would gladly trade the entire state of Florida. With an ironclad commitment to NATO's Article 5, though, nations under the American nuclear umbrella could feel safe and snug in America's big, strong, radioactive nuclear arms, knowing that the US had the credibility to respond in case of a crisis. This directly helped limit nuclear proliferation and thus reduce the risk of humanity permanently logging off because it was too stupid to not blow itself up. Averting global nuclear disaster, stopping Europe's favorite hobby of waging war against itself, and setting the stage for the EU is basically going to make you a ringer for the gold medal in the best alliances in history category. But despite that, Ukraine has proven that NATO is a failure, completely biffing its biggest challenge since the Cold War. In the early Cold War, it was a crazy time. The end of it was even crazier. The entire world breathed a sigh of relief as the specter of nuclear annihilation vanished. Europe's unity took massive steps forward, and grunge music was destroying the majesty of the 80s hair metal power ballads. Humanity had negotiated the nuclear minefield that was the Cold War, with NATO at the forefront. But the moment the Berlin Wall fell, so too did NATO spending. By the fall of the Soviet Union, NATO defense spending was in free fall, and it was its European contingent which was the worst offender by a very long shot. The next war would be fought with hugs and kind affirmations, at least if you asked European NATO members, busily slashing defense budgets so they could buy more croissants and build more discotheque. The United States also severely curtailed its defense budget and sat down leaders from its entire defense sector for a teary-eyed breakup. Unlike Europe, however, the US was now the world's sole superpower, which put the responsibility of upholding the new global order on its shoulders. Plus, it turns out that shaping the world in your own image is crazy lucrative. Thus, while defense spending plummeted across NATO, the US and a few other partners maintained a strong commitment to defense spending. But as the world entered the 2000s, it was clear that Europe had become drunk on peace and free healthcare, and its militaries were in a truly sorry state. While just 10 years prior, European militaries were the vanguards of the First Gulf War, in 2002, Europe struggled to meet the combat requirements of the new war in the Middle East. Then, over the course of the next 8 years, the continent learned exactly the wrong lesson. Though here it's not alone in its blame, the United States also got terror tunnel vision, practically reshaping its military to fight low-intensity guerrilla wars against terrorists and insurgents and leaving it completely unprepared for the rise of China and Russia as new conventional rivals. In 2006, it was clear the alliance had allowed its military power to atrophy. Thus, NATO defense ministers collectively agreed to a commitment of 2% of GDP to be spent on defense spending. However, this proved a tough sell to the European people. After all, the Soviets were gone. Russia was just a big, cuddly, corrupt teddy bear that gave you cheap gas. And who would fund free art classes for stray street dogs if the government spent money on the military? Unsurprisingly, nations failed to meet the 2% spending goal. Incredibly though, even after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, still, only 7 nations meet this spending goal: the US, UK, Poland, Estonia, Greece, Latvia, and Lithuania. We're not going to say that Europe freeloaded off the US's commitment to defend Europe, but Europe definitely freeloaded off of America's treaty obligations to defend Europe, a fact which has over the years brought increasing frustration for US voters. But the truth is that a stable, secure Europe is of direct national security interest for the US, and America benefits greatly politically and financially from a peaceful Europe. Thus, U.S. military investments in European security pay a peace dividend that both sides of the Atlantic have enjoyed for decades. However, It would be nice to see Europe start picking up the tab for their own defense. The Russian invasion of Ukraine showed what many Western defense analysts had known for years. Europe has allowed its military capabilities to atrophy to criminal levels. Germany can't meet NATO's rapid response force requirements without cannibalizing its own military for spare parts and battle-ready personnel. The British military has shrunk to its smallest size since the Napoleonic Wars and is set to shrink even further, to a level not seen since the 1700s. The French military is probably the best prepared on the continent, but it is poorly suited for a modern high-attrition campaign such as the current war in Ukraine. In 2021, analysts Hugo Meyer and Stephen G. Brooks released an article in the journal International Security, arguing that Europeans were incapable of mounting a credible defense of their continent without direct U.S. support. Their first claim is that Europe's defense deficiencies are so deep it would require a massive and protracted effort to fix them. Second, they argue that while Europe outmatches Russia in GDP, population, defense spending, and technology, Russia is still more than a credible match for a unified Europe. But the biggest problem is what Brooks and Meyer called strategic cacophony inside Europe. Simply put, European security experts at the time couldn't argue on what threat to focus on and what capabilities to prioritize to counter it. Given all these problems, the article claimed that Europe was deeply reliant on the United States as a guarantor of their security and incapable of providing for their own defense. At the time, the article drew intense criticism, and not just from the Europeans. Meyer and Brooks argued that the U.S. needed to remain deeply embedded in European security and also drew criticism from Americans. However, just 1 year later, Russia invaded Ukraine and proved that Europe was exactly what they had predicted it was: uncoordinated, deficient, and completely reliant on the U.S. And it was Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Europe's failure to meet its own defense requirement that directly led to NATO's greatest failure, one that could still spell disaster for the entire planet. NATO's failure began all the way back in 2013. At the time, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych prompted Ukrainians to revolt in what would become known as the Euromaidan protests. Under the direct influence of Russia's Vladimir Putin, Yanukovych canceled plans to sign a political association and free trade agreement that would have brought it closer to the EU and on the pathway to membership. Instead, Yanukovych opted to pull Ukraine closer to Russia. To say that this was an unpopular move would be the understatement of the century, and the Ukrainian people politely voiced their displeasure by setting half the country on fire and getting into street wars with the police. On a side note, we're not sure how President Putin saw footage like this and thought that 8 years later his troops would be welcomed into Ukraine with open arms. Learn to read a room, Vladdy. The Euromaidan protests would become the revolution of dignity, with President Yanukovych fleeing to Russia after being ousted from power. The country saw brutal street battles between protesters and the police. Eventually, the revolution would be victorious, but Russia would take advantage of the chaos to make its first move on Ukraine. Russian disinformation agents stoked fears amongst large segments of the pro-Russian Crimean population. One such tool was a documentary claiming that pro-Maidan Ukrainians had stopped several buses full of anti-Maidan protesters and killed and tortured many of them. This stoked fear of the new Ukrainian government, which Putin would use to aid him in the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. On February 22nd and 23rd, Putin convened an all-night meeting with the chiefs of his security services to discuss how to extricate President Viktor Yanukovych from Ukraine. By the end of the meeting, though, Putin made it clear that Russia needed to act quite soon to, quote, return Crimea to Russia. The GRU and FSB immediately began dispatching agents to negotiate with pro-Russian locals and ensure the creation of well-armed local defense groups which would support a Russian invasion. The Crimean government, which operated with a high degree of autonomy, declared that it would support the new Kyiv government. In response, a pro-Russian rally was held in Simferopol, where the Ukrainian flag was replaced with a Russian flag, while a pro-Euromaidan rally demanded the resignation of the Crimean parliament. In Sevastopol, Russia used criminal elements such as the Night Wolves motorcycle club to arm and organize pro-Russian supporters into civil defense squads, setting the stage for Russia's invasion. On February 27th of 2014, Russian forces carrying no insignia invaded Crimea and seized the Crimean parliament building. There, the parliament was forced to vote in an emergency session to replace the prime minister with a member of the Russian Unity Party, which had received only 4% of the vote in the last election. MPs would later tell the press that Russian troops forbade them from talking to journalists and took their phones, and later they found out that most of them had their votes cast for them. Russian President Vladimir Putin denied accusations that his troops were in Ukraine, claiming instead that the entire affair was being organized and executed by Ukrainian separatists. However, by summer, Crimea was annexed as a territory of the Russian Federation, and Russia finally admitted to having troops on the peninsula. The international response was swift and flaccid. The UN passed a non-binding resolution with 100 in favor, 11 against, and 58 abstentions, declaring the annexation invalid, sending Russia the equivalent of a frowny face emoji over text. Sanctions preventing Russian and Crimean officials from traveling to Canada, the US, or the EU were passed, and Japan issued mild sanctions, suspending talks relating to military, space, investment, and visa requirements with Russia. The sanctions were largely seen as a joke by the Russian Federation, with the Russian Duma passing a resolution by unanimous vote asking the West for all members of the Duma to be included on the sanctions list. NATO's failures in Ukraine began with the Russian annexation of Crimea. While economic sanctions did have some effect on the Russian economy, they failed to target Putin or those closest to him directly. They also were not targeted in their scope, limiting their impact on Russia's ability to wage further aggression against Ukraine. Future sanctions would be a bit more robust, forbidding the sale of certain dual-use technologies to Russia that could be used for both civilian and military applications, seriously hurting Putin's ability to provide drones to his armed forces, for example. However, overall, the sanctions failed to deter Russia from further aggression. NATO's military response was equally flaccid and consisted mostly of the alliance's easternmost members asking for more American presence in their countries. The Baltic states, as well as Poland and Romania, saw the writing on the wall and realized that they were now on the front line of a new conflict with Russia. Thus, they demanded permanently stationed brigades on their territory from NATO, but naturally only the US was prepared to meet the requirement. Poland reached out to the US directly and asked for protection, with the US deploying 2 brand new infantry brigades to Polish bases, as well as strengthening its armored forces in the region. Plans for a new forward deployment base in Poland to house 1,000 US soldiers were quickly finalized, and Romania followed suit by building a new military base on the Black Sea to serve as a forward deployment point for US troops. Bulgaria partnered with the US to expand its military bases and bought tanks and missile systems from US firms, with Lithuania hosting a rotating US motorized brigade and buying new US equipment to train with. While in many ways these decisions were a boon to the US defense industry, they also severely strained America's military and logistics. Americans, rightfully so, began to question why it was them picking up the tab for European defense, a sentiment which President Donald Trump made very clear as he mulled over removing the US from NATO. The lack of a credible military deterrent on NATO's borders allowed Putin to act with near impunity in his Crimean invasion, as did the divisiveness among NATO's members on Russia itself. The United States and the Baltic nations, alongside Poland and Romania, have long called for the continued containment of Russia as a potential adversary, but the rest of NATO's European members have been extremely reluctant to cooperate on any measure to contain Russia. Instead, they all but sabotaged NATO from within. Germany aggressively pursued economic ties with Russia, working under the false assumption that close economic ties would make Russia a more agreeable neighbor. However, despite repeated warnings from the US, Germany basically handed Russia all the leverage it wanted over it. It not only helped speed Europe's energy dependence on Russia through investments in the Nord Stream pipeline, but it actually helped sabotage energy sanctions against Russia over the invasion of Crimea by lobbying for their removal. In its hunger for cheap energy and new markets, Germany did all it could to hand Russia the keys to Europe. Turkey, France, Italy, and Hungary too scuttled NATO plans to mobilize more resources to counter potential Russian aggression. Seeking closer financial ties, the 4 nations feared that pursuing a containment strategy and clearly naming Russia as a European security threat would jeopardize economic relations with Russia. Turkey, now a thorn in NATO's side under President Erdogan's rule, even went against NATO policy and purchased air defense systems from Russia. As a result, the US kicked Turkey out of the F-35 program, resulting in chilly relations that persist to this day. Indeed, Turkey has since been walking a tightrope between its commitment to NATO and its ties to Russia. Right when it mattered the most, the NATO alliance was too busy enriching itself to effectively deter Russia. The failure of NATO to react strongly to Russia's invasion of Ukraine directly opened the door for 2022's invasion of Ukraine. But this larger invasion would prove that NATO had catastrophically failed yet again. The US warned for months that Russia could be considering an invasion of Ukraine, but was met with consternation from most of the European powers. Like in 2014, Most European nations didn't wish to antagonize Russia and disrupt lucrative energy and business ties, leaving the US and the easternmost NATO members alone in their warnings that a Russian invasion was becoming increasingly probable. Even when it became painfully obvious that an invasion was coming, Western Europe was reluctant to believe it. Once more, NATO's disparate agendas ensured that Putin would be free to act, and thanks to the lobbying of many NATO members, Russia believed it had great leverage over NATO in the form of energy to prevent it from responding. Exactly when NATO should have been unified and immediately delivering military aid to Ukraine about to be under siege, the alliance was too disjointed to tie its own shoelaces. And this aid could have turned the tide of history had it been provided pre-invasion or even just after it. A significant buildup of Western military hardware in Ukrainian hands would have served as a powerful deterrent to Putin, as would have the promise of immediate and strong sanctions. While those sanctions would eventually come around, they only did so after the invasion had begun, when they should have been threatened before it was launched in order to deter Putin. As the invasion began, though, NATO hesitated to send any military hardware, for fear that the Ukrainian government would collapse under a fierce Russian onslaught. This was back when the West was still drinking Russia's Kool-Aid and believed it was a capable combined arms power simply because it put on a fancy choreographed exercise once a year or so across the border from the Baltic countries. However, this highlights yet another of NATO's failures. After the annexation of Crimea, the US and a few NATO partners undertook a training and restructuring program with the Ukrainian military. What should have happened, however, is a full commitment by NATO to bring the Ukrainian military up to par with Western militaries. Well, the ones that actually work anyway, including a continued replenishment of its old Soviet equipment with modern Western counterparts. This, even more than sanctions, would have been the strongest deterrent against further Russian aggression. When it became clear that Ukraine would hold off Russia, talks began to supply Ukraine with the heavy equipment it needed to defend itself from Russia. And continuing its long tradition of doing everything possible to help Russia win, NATO once more dropped the ball. Spurred on by fears of imaginary escalation, NATO refused to provide Ukraine with large amounts of heavy equipment, to which Poland said, "Hold my pierogi," and sent as much heavy equipment as it could anyways. Even the US appeared timid about hurting Putin's feelings by stopping his genocide of the Ukrainian people, as it took months to send a limited amount of advanced weapons such as the HIMARS to Ukraine. But it wouldn't stop there, because while NATO gradually opened up its armories to Ukraine, it was like pulling teeth. Every single shipment of new weapons had to be hemmed and hawed over by each NATO member, carefully deliberated over the course of weeks and months to gauge just how much of Putin's feelings it would hurt. Tanks, the weapons Ukraine needed the most, would take almost an entire year to begin considering sending to Ukraine. And even then, only after Germany gaslit the entire alliance over Leopard 2s and then just straight up lied and moved the goalposts 3 times, were the tanks finally approved to be sent to Ukraine. By the way, feel free to exclude Poland and the Baltic states from all of this. If they'd been in charge of NATO, they would have given Ukraine every single tank in NATO's inventory on day 2 of the invasion. Poland would have probably personally driven the tank straight to the front lines itself. It's exactly this disharmony amongst the alliance that created NATO's biggest failure in the alliance's history, and it's only compounded by the absolutely terrible state of its military and military-industrial capacity. Heavy weapons should have been provided from the moment the assault on Kyiv was defeated, and the decision to slowly trickle them in makes NATO directly responsible for the deaths of thousands of Ukrainian service members and civilians both. Even when it became clear Russia was engaging in a campaign of war crimes against Ukrainian civilians, NATO refused to move quicker on weapons deliveries. But NATO's terrible readiness for conventional conflict is also wrapped up in its massive Ukrainian failure pie. While European was on a peaceful bender, its militaries and defense industries atrophied. The fact that NATO has been unable to out-resupply Russia inside of Ukraine is absolutely criminal. Perplexingly, NATO's European members have even further slowed deliveries of heavy weapons to Ukraine by refusing to send them from their own active inventories. When the question of sending Leopard 2s to Ukraine came up, Europe collectively scrambled to see what Leopards it thought it could afford to send, coming up with a token force of around 80 tanks. To date, very few of those 80 promised tanks have actually been sent. And here we have to ask why? Why so few tanks? Ask the Western Europeans and they'll say that they need their tanks for their own defense, to which we would respond with, defense from what? What war exactly does Western Europe think it needs tanks to defend from, when no power on earth save the US has the logistics to even reach Western Europe, and Russia is such a failure of military power it's stuck on the east of Ukraine? If anyone needs tanks, it's NATO's eastern members, who are the shield Russia would have to punch through just to get to Germany. Unless Russia learns how to grow T-14s and T-90s on trees, then teleport them 1,000 miles from Russia into the heart of France, we're pretty sure that Western Europe needs its tanks right now like the ocean needs water. And the United States isn't off the hook either, as it alone has hundreds of armored vehicles in storage that could easily be provided to Ukraine, many of them already in pre-positioned stocks in Europe, specifically placed there to fight Russia. Make no mistake, Russia is fully committed in Ukraine and completely incapable of threatening the rest of Europe. Russian KIA were estimated at 60,000 in February. By now, this number is estimated to have reached as high as 100,000. 2 to 3 times that number are estimated to have been wounded. The Russian military is in such a sorry state that it's even now beginning another round of quiet mobilization and blocked the Wagner group from recruiting in prisons so that the regular Russian army could do it instead. And still, NATO acts as if there's a credible threat to its European members that it needs to defend from, refusing to open up its active inventories to Ukrainian requests for tanks and other aid. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has been NATO's greatest failure, from a failure to respond to Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, a failure to properly prepare for a conventional war, a failure to deter the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, and a failure to quickly end the war by providing Ukraine with large amounts of badly needed equipment. Instead of the decisive action needed to stop Vladimir Putin dead in his tracks, the NATO alliance's response has been glacial, disjointed, and inadequate. And NATO's failures have only opened up the door to further conflicts around the world of the exact type the alliance was initially determined to deter from ever happening. While Western sanctions against Russia have given China a slight pause in its ambition to retake Taiwan by force, NATO's flaccid military response has only emboldened it to act, knowing that Taiwan would be much harder to supply in the midst of a full-scale war than Ukraine is. An invasion of Taiwan would disrupt the global semiconductor market, throwing the entire global economy into a tailspin. A successful invasion, however, would then place an authoritarian China, hostile to democratic ideals, in charge of the most important resource of the 21st century, with Taiwan producing over 60% of the world's computer chips and 90% of the most advanced ones critical for cutting-edge technologies. To prevent China from holding the Western-led liberal world order hostage through chip embargoes, decisive action and unity is needed from the only international alliance capable of stopping the Chinese Communist Party. And right now, the odds of that happening aren't looking too good, as the most successful international alliance in history, made up of the richest nations in history, struggles to win a war in its own backyard. Now go check out Putin's new major problem for Russian military revealed, or click this other video instead.